You're listening to Passions and Prologues, a literary podcast where each week I interview an author about a thing they love and how it inspires their work. I'm your host, Adam Sokol, and today's guest is Lyndall Clipstone, fantasy author of the new book, Unholy Terrors. We had a delightful conversation about basically where she finds her passion for the fantasy genre. And it all started with some truly, truly wonderful RPG video games that you can kind of choose your own adventure and decide the character's arc that you want to be and how the story turns out. It's a lot of fun. I really, really love this conversation. I used to be a big video game person. I'm not so much anymore just because of timing, but it was fun to talk about some of the video games that I used to play when I was younger, which were very much the same style. These games that it was a very open world and you could decide what would happen with your character and whether they were going to be good or bad and the consequences that they were going to experience. It was just really fun kind of falling back into that world and uncovering how Lyndall used that to inspire herself to first write fan fiction and then create worlds completely out of nothing for herself. Really, really loved it. Love the book. It is a perfect book for this time of year where it's, if you're listening to this when the episode comes out, Halloween was just yesterday, and we're still in that kind of dark and cold time of year where there's nothing better than curling up with a good book and getting lost into a new world. And along those lines, if you'd like an additional book to get lost into a new world, I just finished The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi by S.A. Chakraborty, or Shannon Chakraborty, which is what she goes by as this particular title. If you are a fan of fantasy novels and pirates, you are going to adore this book. Amina El-Sarafi is a female captain of a pirate crew, but she has basically retired. She has put that in her past, but she is very, very infamous and known all across the seven seas. And when a young girl goes missing, the grandmother comes and basically asks Amina El-Sarafi to take on one last job, and it's an offer she cannot refuse. So it turns into a bit of a heist story that is all along the seven seas. It has all of the piratey goodness you would want. There's swashbuckling, there's treasure, but there's also all these fantasy elements about gods and mortals and big monsters and all sorts of stuff. Just a wonderful book. I think you're really, really going to love it. I adored that. That's The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi. And it really does pair nicely with Unholy Terrors by Lyndall Clipstone. I think you'll adore both of those books. If you want to get a hold of me, if you want some additional book recommendations or just see what I'm up to lately, you can always find me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at Passions and Prologues, or you can shoot me an email at passionsandprologues@gmail.com. I'm always happy to chat with you there as well. That is all the housekeeping. I am going to let you dive into this discussion with Lyndall Clipstone, author of Unholy Terrors, on Passions and Prologues. Okay, Lyndall, what is something you are super passionate about that we're going to be discussing today?
I am super passionate about the Dragon Age video games, particularly Dragon Age Inquisition.
I love it. Okay, so first things first, let's start at the beginning. What was kind of your introduction to video games? Like, what got you into the thing that made you fall in love with it?
I've always really loved playing games. I think I've been sort of just a gamer for my whole life since I had like a Nintendo. And my partner who I met when I was in high school is also like a really big gamer. So like we kind of united in our love for video games. But I was really, really into this video game called Knights of the Old Republic, which was like a Star Wars sort of role-playing game. And one of the best parts of it for me was that there was this really strong sort of element of you could have relationships with all of the characters, and like those interactions sort of shaped the story. And that was absolutely like, I'm always searching for more games like that. So that was what led me to Dragon Age, because it was created by the same game company at the time. So yeah, I played like the first one quite a long time ago, and then the second one, and then there was just something about Inquisition. I think because it's been so long between games that
Mm-hmm.
I played through it, and just everything was so perfect. Like the setup. So the game starts where there's like this sort of, I'm trying to think of the word for it, a coming together of like all of the different factions in the realm to do sort of like a peace talk, and then there's like a horrible explosion and it kills like the game's version of the Pope called the Divine, and they think you did it because you're the only person who survives coming out of the wreckage, and you've got this weird thing embedded in your hand that can actually coincidentally close like the tears in the fabric of the world that have now opened up because of the explosion. So like it's just the way that you're put into the game as a character is really fun as well. You're like, oh, you know, like this mystery around you, and now you have to unite everybody together, and it sort of goes on where like you can make sort of good and bad choices, and that sort of shapes.
Mm-hmm.
I really love how like you can participate in the world so much. And I did such a thorough playthrough. I was a mage, a human mage inquisitor, which in the world of Dragon Age, mages are sort of, they're forced to live in like sort of, I guess like a prison, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
call it a prison. And it's like they're kind of feared. And it's interesting because even within the game, like that's not kind of interrogated particularly well. I feel like there's so much more that they could delve into with that. But you're a mage, and then you can choose who to romance out of your party. And I romanced a Templar called
Mm-hmm.
Cullen, and he was like an ex-Templar. So it was like ideological opposites, which is like my
Mm-hmm.
absolute kryptonite. You know, you're like this mage who's kind of come from whatever, and he's like his previous job was like enforcing the mage's imprisonment. So that was so fun, and I did like a very very thorough like 90-hour playthrough where
Mm-hmm.
I explored every piece of the world and all of the little extra sort of add-on stories, and there's like the side characters can romance each other as well, so I got like all of them together, and then they had like a epilogue sort of where it's set like I think a few years in the future, and it sort
Mm-hmm.
of explores like where all the characters have gone. And I was like, when I finished that, I cried like somebody had died. I was so bereft. It was like the biggest game hangover ever. But
Uh-huh.
it's just like as a writer, I think getting so immersed in that sort of world was such a good way of sort of directing my brain into like the storytelling mode, because you're literally like playing out the story, and it's like I love this experience so much. How can I replicate this in
Oh my, I
my
know. So there was a game. Oh gosh, it's at least 10 years ago at this point. I know it's a series, but Fable 2 is,
Oh yeah, Fable is
I,
good.
I remember like sort like how you were talking about, like it just the idea. I remember that being really the first game that I had played. I know there were many more before that, but like the first one that I had happened to pick up, where exactly what you said, like your choices in the game, they let you be however you wanted to be, whether it was like a goody two shoes or like just purely an awful piece of garbage. You could do whatever you wanted, and like you could still complete the game, however, but like basically the choices you made determined your abilities and the way that other people, like NPCs,
Yeah, and
perceived
then like the
you.
physical appearance changed as part of
Yeah.
it.
And I just remember being blown away. Like you said, I've always been like a book nerd at my heart, but I do have like I don't play video games anymore, not for like lack of wanting to, but I still have this like tangential interest. Like I'll find myself watching playthroughs of like the new Zelda and stuff just because I'm very fascinated by it. And but I remember that game specifically. I was like you said, it was such an immersive experience, being like, oh, I am not only playing through this story, I'm changing this story.
Yeah, it was really fun. We always joke about that game because I married the town crier in Fable 2. And like you would be like in your bedroom together, like, and then they'd sort of like fade to black, and then he'd be like, get your titles. And I'm just like, oh, but that's the thing. I'm like, oh, you could do anything in this game. I'm going to romance the town crier and marry him and have a family. I'm like, why would I do that? But it was just
Because you
really
can.
because you
So
can. Yeah.
so did the I assume like when you got done with your massive game hangover, like did you go back and play it a different way, or did you just kind of mourn the loss of the game and move on?
I had played it a few times before. So I'd played it through as like a male character because there's a character in there called Dorian who's a mage, and I really wanted to romance him. So, and he's gay, so you have to play as a male presenting character to romance him. So I played through like that. And then I think I got really invested into the game and I was like, no, I want to romance Cullen. So here's the setup. And I have sort of gone back in because one of the best romantic pairings in the game is romancing the elven character whose name I have now forgotten, Solus. I can't believe I totally blanked that out. So the Solus Mounts is like the core big angsty dramatic romance of the game because he turns out to be the big villain of the whole series, or that sort of part of the game. So I started playing again as an elven character with the thought of romancing him, but it's just, I think I did such a thorough playthrough that I'm ready for something different. So I went on, I played The Witcher 3, which has got kind of a similar kind of vibe where you're Geralt, but you can still make choices in the game that will affect everything. And then I got really deeply into Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is so cute. It's like you're the professor at this military academy and you have like this little class of students, but it's also got like this very like matchmaking element where you can romance one of them and then you can also pair up the characters. So like I've just done millions of playthroughs of that, being like, okay, cool, who am I going to put together this time? So yeah, but I love Dragon Age, and I think if I ever have like the time to sit down and the desire, like I would love to go back in and just do like a really complete sort of playthrough again. I'm waiting for the new one to come out. They keep sort of delaying it, and it's like it's going to be amazing when it is done. But
that's the problem with like these massive games is they're not too dissimilar from like fantasy novels where
I mean, I'm still eagerly waiting the rest of the Song of Ice and Fire books.
I read all of so many other people.
I think Dance of the Dragons had just come out when I was pregnant with my first son, and I was on maternity leave, and I just got completely obsessed and read all of the books. I'd listen to like Game of Thrones lore podcast when I couldn't sleep, and I'm just like, yes, can't wait for Winds of Winter. And here we are, like my son's just turned 11, and I'm like, well, one day.
Yeah, listen, my favorite author is Erin Morgenstern. I adore her. I got to interview her when The Starless Sea came out, which has since become my favorite book. I have a Starless Sea tattoo. Like I adore it. And she's only written 2 books. It was that and The Night Circus. And I think those 2 were 7 years apart. And she told me
I feel like that just about Donna Tartt, who wrote The Secret History. One of my favorites, and like everybody has all these predictions of like, well, about every 10 years she does a new book, and like honestly good on them, because I feel like doing especially like YA fiction, there's this kind of, you get on this track of like a book a year and it's exhausting. And
I was just gonna say
take a year between, like I'm not releasing a book next year, and I'm really looking forward to having like a year off, because I think you need that sometimes creatively to just have a little bit of
yeah, that's such an interesting, and I want to get into your books in just a second, but I want to ask if why do you think that is? Because you're right. Like, I feel like YA fantasy, they're not that much shorter. It's not like it's not less of a lift on you as an author as compared to like a quote unquote adult fantasy writer. But like, why do you think there is such a demand or a like expectation as a YA fantasy author that you're going to have a book come out every year?
Who puts the demand? Like if maybe it's a pressure we put on ourselves, as well as like, I know with a series, like I think the publishers like they want to keep people's attention, and like I'm going to sound all Ridley Scott and grumpy about like technology, but I feel like people's attention spans are not, like it's hard to keep someone's attention span for a long time because there's so many different things all happening at once. And so I feel like, especially with a series, they want you to, to catch you while you're still interested, rather than, like the first book of that came out 5 years ago. But I think there's always room. Like if you're really struggling as an author, I don't think you should feel pressured to like churn the book out. Like I think you can push the deadline if you need to. But for me, I think, especially when I started as a debut author, I think I felt a lot of pressure to just break out. And I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of pressure around debuts where like you feel like it's your only chance. And if your first book isn't like this gigantic blockbuster, then that's it for you. And you have to keep going, because if you stop, then everyone will forget about you, and, you know, like someone else will come in. And I
Mm.
guess it's the attention span sort of thing. So I don't know how much of that is actually truth and how much of it is just me putting pressure on myself, because I think probably like a lot of creative people, I'm a big perfectionist and very hard on myself and
Yeah.
try to unlearn a lot of that. But I feel really fortunate to be in a position where I'm not writing a series. I've got 3 books out in the world now. I'll have like a paperback release next year. So I have like a bit of breathing room to go, no, I think I need a year, like I need a longer amount of time before
Hmm.
I write something next, because I want more time to sort of have space between projects, sit with it and let it be its own thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never really thought about that, and I have a YA author that I'm talking with, and I was like, you know what? I'm curious, like if you like you said, if that's demand by others or the self-imposed, which I'm sure, much like most things, is a little column A,
Yeah,
a
I
little
think it's
column
probably
B.
a bit of everything. I mean, and also
Yeah,
financially, you know, like if you want to keep like any kind of creative industry, it's very like a weird sort of windfall kind of feeling
yeah,
payment. You know, you'll get a book advance and then you'll get it paid out. And then until you sell another book, you're not sort of, so I think financially as well, people kind of like to keep selling books for that
yeah.
reason, which is perfectly
That's a
legitimate.
good reason too. Yeah.
Yes, definitely a good
Yeah.
reason.
You mentioned before we started recording that Dragon Age has had an influence on your writing of kind of like in a direct through line. You mentioned that you had done some sort of some fan fiction. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit, and how this video game that you adore has sort of kind of catapulted you into the creative side of the world?
Yeah, so I'd always written my own sort of work. I did creative writing honors at university, but it was all like short pieces, sort of short stories. And
Hmm.
I found the idea of writing like a novel length thing so daunting. Like I'm sure a lot of people do, where you just think, how do you write that many words? How do you write a story that spans like, and so, as sort of like a challenge to myself, I decided to do NaNoWriMo, and I decided to write Dragon Age fan fiction as my thing, because I love reading fan fiction. And I think that was sort of like supplementary to playing the game. I was also very immersed in reading like a lot of
Hmm.
really detailed Dragon Age fanfic stories, and I wanted to write my own ones. So it was kind of like a good way for me to creatively train my sort of stamina, I guess, because I had these
Mm.
in the world that was already built. And so I was sort of playing around in this sandbox that was already created and learning how to write a story that would go for 50,000 words or however long it was meant to be. And all of that, and like just proving to myself that I could do it as well. So
Hmm.
it was good fun. And it was like I sort of, as I played through the game, I wrote the story as well. So it was just this very like creatively immersive experience that was really lovely, and kind of, I guess, put me in the zone of wanting to continue doing that with my own work.
So how did you transition then from, like you said, fan fiction? You have the advantage, quote unquote, of it's a pre-existing world. You don't have to do the world building from scratch. So how did you transition from that to like, okay, I actually want to make a go of building my own world and creating my own story and trying to query it and all that fun stuff?
I think like a big part of it was like proving to myself that I could write something that was novel length. So
Hmm.
doing it as like a fan fiction thing, I was like, okay, like just I am capable of producing this amount of words, which was like something that was really empowering to discover
Yeah.
for me, who'd only ever written sort of short fiction. But the book that became my first book, which was Lake's Edge, that was the book that I queried and gained an agent with. That had actually been like a short story that I'd written as part of my honors year. And I'd always sort of felt like I wasn't done with it, felt like I wanted to explore it a little bit more. And so I was feeling so like encouraged after writing this NaNoWriMo piece that I was like, well, why don't I try now to do this with my own sort of work? Because it was just at a time in my life where I was feeling like trying to pursue publication had always felt too scary, I think,
Mhm.
because rejection, I'm like, if I don't try, I can't fail kind of thing. So
Yeah.
even though, because people often ask me, oh, did you always want to be an author? And I'm like, I did, but I didn't sort of give myself permission to want it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then I got to a stage in my life where my work contract was finished. My youngest was starting school. And so it worked out to make more sense for me to be like a stay-at-home parent. And then I thought I wanted to go back to university and study creative writing again, but I didn't get into the program. And I was like, maybe I could just do this on my own. Like, maybe I don't need a program. Like, I don't need to go to university to write a novel. So I just sort of thought I may as well. Like, I was just at the stage in my life where I'm like, now is the time to be brave and see what happens. So I wrote the manuscript. I was lucky enough to get mentored in a program called Author Mentor Match, where I learned a lot about writing from a very generous published author who mentored me. And then that sort of led into querying and luckily finding an agent.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing I'm as someone who is currently querying, it is, it can be exhausting and a bummer and frustrating, but then like, I don't know, I keep like the way I thought about it when I was writing this book was it was something where I was talking to a friend of mine who is an author and also a book podcaster. And I remember talking to her and saying, like, there should be more books of like X, Y, and Z. And she's like, so write it. And I was like, well, but I want to read it. And she's like, if you want to read it, other people want to read it too. And if it doesn't
Yeah, and that's the
exist,
thing. Like, I've always sort of tried to write the books that I want to read because I know, like, I remember with querying, like, there's always this pressure of like trying to predict what the market will want or trying to write something. And like, nobody knows.
yeah,
Like, I wish
no
you
idea.
could predict what the market would want. Like, how amazing would that be? But at the same time, like, I think if you write something that you're so in love with and passionate about, there must be other people out there who are going to love it. And that will shine through with your writing as
Yeah.
well.
And the fact that like you said, the idea, if you try to think of like, I'm going to write a novel, yes, it sounds crazy, but it's only crazy until you start doing it. And then once you've done it, like, and you're an unpublished author who's querying, you might think to yourself, like, the idea that I would ever be a published author is crazy, but it's only crazy until it isn't. Like, it's one of those things where I don't know. I always think that about like when I talk to debut authors, like, it's so
Yeah.
unbelievable that I'm in this space. I'm like, well, maybe, but
And
it's
I
not. Yeah.
there's like a good case to be made for like giving yourself permission to be proud of your creative
Yeah.
work, even without the gatekeeping sort of thing, because publishing is such a fickle industry that does not, much to my constant frustration, it's not like a merit-based thing where you have these really clear parameters of, okay, now you've made it, okay, now you've done a good thing. It's always shifting, and you really have to sort of give yourself validation to sort of keep going. And I remember before I was querying and people would ask, like, what do you do? And I guess like there was this tendency for me to be like, oh, I'm just a stay-at-home parent. But then I'd be like, no, I'm a writer. I write because that's what I was doing every day when my children
Mhm.
were at school. I'd sit down and treat it like a job, even before I was like a published author or I had an agent. Like I didn't want to let like, okay, I'm not allowed to take this seriously until X. So I
Mhm.
think you're allowed to call yourself a writer if you are a writer. Like you don't have to wait for an agent to sort of choose you out of the slush pile. So I think, and it's hard to do that. It's hard to sort of claim like validity of creative work because it's sort of, it can feel so frivolous. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, oh, not at home trying to, cure world hunger. You're just writing books. But at the same time, like it's important work. So
Well, and I think it's like because there's this belief. So we're gonna get to your book in one moment. I just really love this conversation.
that's
I promise. I'm
okay.
so sorry. It's just I love the thought of like you said, people seem to think because in theory, because we're just sitting at home on a computer, like in theory, anyone can write a book, and in theory that is true. But for someone to be able to create whole new worlds, to create entire characters out of thin air and plot lines and build together a cohesive story, like that is something that should be celebrated, even if you're not quote unquote published yet or you don't have an agent. Like you said, if you are right, like if I was going to university, I would call myself a student. I would say I'm studying creative writing. I am a writer because I am writing a story. Like I totally agree with you. I love that mindset of like, no, I'm a writer. That's what I'm doing right now. I love that so much. So
Yeah, and it's like it's no small thing. Like sitting down and having the like stamina to finish writing a book is like it's a big deal. Like I often have
mhm,
people ask me like, how do you write a book? And I'm like, I honestly I think it's just doing it. Like there's no
mhm.
easy way around it, which is kind of unfortunate a lot of the time because it'd be nice to have a shortcut. But yeah, like the dedication that it takes, it's a career that really demands like a lot of dedication and self-discipline. And yeah,
Yeah, there's no way to cheat that process.
definitely
Okay,
not.
so speaking of your writing, can you introduce my listeners to your new book, Unholy Terrors? And I want to ask you some questions about that. But before I do, can you kind of introduce them to your latest novel?
Okay, so Unholy Terrors is a standalone dark romantic fantasy about a girl who is a holy warrior and she has to team up with the monstrous boy she's sworn to kill, ostensibly to stop the rise of a terrible eldritch power, but she's also interested in finding out about her origins.
And how did it feel after writing a couple books, like you said, that were the first two were in the same world? Is that correct? Right?
Yeah, their duology.
Yeah. How did it feel to once again be kind of creating a world from scratch after spending so much time in the previous one you had created?
I really enjoyed it. So it's actually been like a story that I'd had sort of like the little seedling ideas for quite a while, because it was the book which became Unholy Terrors, which was a very different story to begin with, was what I was working on as my like, you know how people say, do you like write the weight? So while I was querying Lake Sedge, this was the project that I was distracting myself with. But I think it was really, really enjoyable to write. Like, this is my first book that I sold after my debut book deal because I sold like two books. So it was my
Hmm.
first book, like an established author, my first non debut sort of book, my first book after writing a series. It felt really, it just felt good to be able to
Hmm.
sort of prove to myself that, like, yes, I can do this. I can write something else other than like because there's always this fear. I'm like, what if this is it? Maybe I could only ever write one book, but they do continue. Like, it's nice to know that I can continue to sort of find
Yeah.
find more stories. And it was just fun. It was fun after working on the same characters and story for, nearly 3 years to be able to go on to like a new character. And
Hmm. So along those lines, for you, is character what kind of comes first when you were building out a new story, or is it the world or like an action? I guess like what comes to you first as like sort of that first seed of how you want to build out this new adventure?
I think for me, it's definitely character because I adore writing very character driven stories
Mhm.
and reading them. And so I'll sort of start with a character dynamic. Often it'll be like a romantic dynamic. So with Unholy Terrors, I was like, okay, I want it to be an enemies to lovers romance with like a sort of forced alliance between these two characters who have like an ideological opposition. So what would be like a really good setup for that? And then like the idea of like this unholy, holy dichotomy. It's so classic, but there's such a rich sort of well of emotions to draw from. And then like the next sort of stage will be like, I think like the aesthetic of like how I want the book to sort of feel to the
Mhm.
reader. What I want the world to feel like visually, more so than like what sort of do I want to set it in like a medieval fantasy world or whatever. So I think I wanted it to feel different to Lake's Edge, which had been very sort of foresty, gardeny. So I like after I'd read Wuthering Heights, I really wanted to set something in like a moorland kind of because I wanted it to feel different as well, to my previous book. So I came up with this idea of like this desolate moorland that was full of like ruined cathedrals and,
Mhm.
um, how that could sort of become an influence on the type of story that would happen there and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I saw it described somewhere as gothic fantasy, which I adore. Like a
Yes.
perfect description of it. Yeah. Um, I know I really do. I love that. I feel like it's a really you mentioned starting with characters, and for me, that's the same way. Like you can give me a 220-page book about a small town in the States, or you can give me a sprawling 900-page fantasy book. But it doesn't matter what the world is and the actions at its heart. For me, I need to care about the characters. Like I always talk about, I don't love thrillers often because so often it's just like a cast of characters who are all just jerks. And it's like, I want to feel
I think
joy.
when they're done well, though, like I'm a big Gillian Flynn fan, and I think she is a really good example of how to write like a thriller with compelling, like, yeah, non-two-dimensional sort of characters.
Yeah. And to be clear, like there are some I like for sure. And like, but
I
there
know
are
what you
definitely,
mean, though. Like, I think, and there's definitely like different. For me, like I'd often like I really crave like this intersection of fantasy and romance and like prosy writing. It's
yeah.
like the holy grail. And I'd often pick up a book and be like, oh, this one looks good. And I'd start like flipping through it and be like, and so has to sort out the political situation between them. I'm like, no, I don't want that. I want the hot villains. So
Yeah. Well, and but that's the thing is, like you said, when, people may initially people may fall in love with the world that you create, a fantasy world that they can, like you said, they can do their own fan fiction, they can play in the space. But at the end of the day, like I'm not gonna read, like you're talking about before, like all the Game of Thrones, like I'm not gonna read 1,000-page book just because there's dragons in the
no, and I think
background.
like my favorite part of like the Game of Thrones series was the relationship between Jon Snow and Ygritte, where like
Hmm.
again, it was like the reluctant enemies to lovers team up.
Yeah.
And so I think like even when people use that as like an example of like a big sweeping fantasy, he does character like dynamics and character driven stories
Yeah.
well. And that's always what's drawn me in. So
Yeah, like those small stories within the massive
yeah,
plot of
there's
the
like
world.
this
Yeah.
huge, big worldwide scale thing going on, but like you're more interested in like who's Jon Snow's father and like are these people really like the same person? Or are these
Uh,
people gonna like it's great.
so for you, what, if anything, was the most challenging part about writing a new world and new characters and like new adventures? What was there anything that you found challenging about this, or was it all really just like excitement to get at a new project?
I think it was a lot of it was excitement, but there was also like I think a lot of self-confidence in, like there's always this fear of, like with the series, I kind of people knew what they were getting into with the second book because they'd read Lake's Edge. And so
Yeah.
I'm like, will people like this new world as much? Will it be like something that readers connect with? I think it was mostly like it wasn't so much like the actual act of storytelling and writing the book was kind of straightforward and enjoyable for me as a creator, but the sort of worrying about how it would be received and if people would love it. And I think that's
Hmm.
probably something that all authors fear. And also like knowing like the whims of publishing are so uncontrollable and
Hmm.
like wanting the best for this book because I want it to be able to reach as many readers as possible because I'm so proud of the story and like, you want it to be able to connect with the people who will enjoy it. And so much of that is outside of your control. You can't like go around and follow the book everywhere and make sure you have to trust the publisher to sort of do that end of things. And
Hmm.
yeah,
It,
so I think a lot of it is like letting go of what I can't control and accepting what I can. And yeah.
I'm laughing because having interviewed authors for like a decade now, like I said, I've interviewed debut authors who no one had heard of. I've interviewed like the most successful authors in the world and everything in between. And like everyone has that same feeling. Like I remember interviewing V.E. Schwab, and this was not when her career had just started. It was like for the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, a book that has now sold like 3 million
I
copies.
know. I really like it's so funny because I'm like, well, I guess if Beauty Schwab feels like that, then like, because I
And
see
I can,
sometimes she's like, what if nobody ever reads my book? And I'm just like,
yeah,
well, that's not just me
she
who feels
she
like that.
literally told me a story, and she told me I was welcome to share this, but like she literally told me a story. I got to interview her a couple of times. She was talking about how she had a manuscript of a book that hadn't seen the light of day, and she's like, and I was sitting on Neil Gaiman's table pitching him the story, wondering if anyone would like it. And I was like, did you just hear the sentence you just said to me? Like of course people are gonna, but this is all to say, like, I think what you're
Yeah,
feeling is natural.
I think so too. And I think like it's really hard to get out of your own head as well, because it's so like there's such a disconnect from like you're sitting at your desk. I mean, I'm in Australia on the other side of the world, sitting at a
Yeah.
desk writing a story that's coming out all over the world. And it's so easy to feel like, does anyone even know that this is happening? But it does. And I actually, speaking of Via Schwab, she made this really cool post where I think she talked about like, here's all the things that I worry about, and here's all the things that are in my control. And like in my control was like the work. And it's
Yeah.
really, I think, especially now, there's all this pressure on authors where they're like, oh, you should go on TikTok and then you'll go viral and that'll make your career. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to have a career if you don't write a book in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's not my job to make TikTok content. My job and what I want to do is to write books. So
Hmm.
I think we sort of feel like, oh, but if we, if we do this thing, if we go viral, if we go on thing and, whatever. But at the same time, it's like maybe we can't control so much of publishing, but we can control the writing. And I feel like it was B. Schwab. I feel like she knows what she's talking about. So she's very inspirational, and that was really good advice.
Yeah. And to your point before, it's like, I think part of that, like being on TikTok and being all over the place, like there's just this need. People feel this need, like if I'm not in front of people, I'll be forgotten. And like, then what? But like you said, you
I
write a good
definitely
book.
feel that as well. Like, I mean, when Twitter was big, I found it really not great for my mental health as an author. And I struggled for a long time because
Yeah.
I was like, what's going to happen if I leave? Am I going to ruin my career by not being on Twitter talking to people about my book? But in the end, I left, and it was quite cathartic to sort of let that go. And I think I'm a big believer in only doing the kind of social media interaction that brings you joy as an
Hmm.
author. Like, I don't think anyone should feel pressured to be doing things that make them uncomfortable or takes time away from the creative process.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree. The less social media I can do, the happier I am. I
Yeah, I mean,
totally
I
agree.
enjoy it in a way, but I've definitely like had to constantly sort of navigate like how much time I want to give to it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of time, you've been super, super gracious. I have one last question for you. I always end every discussion by having the author who has come on give a recommendation of any kind. It can be a book, it can be a recipe, a TV show, it can be a video game, anything you would like to recommend for people to check out. Now is the time.
Now is the time. Okay. You know what? I think I'm gonna recommend, this has made me think too hard now.
I know, I'm sorry.
Um, so I have been completely immersed in Finley Fenn's Orc Sworn series, which is like a romance fantasy book. Not YA, it's definitely adult, about orcs and the women who love them. And it's been like a complete delight to read. They're so beautifully written, so romantic, so spicy. And it's just been a complete joy to work my way through all of these books while I've been stressed about my upcoming release. So I feel like if anybody likes fantasy romance, is looking for like an excellent distraction at a stressful time, then I recommend those books.
That is absolutely perfect. People will absolutely get lost in Unholy Terrors. It is such a wonderful story, and I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. Passions and Prologues is proud to be an evergreen podcast and was created by Adam Sokol. It was produced by Adam Sokol and Sean Rule Hoffman. And if you are interested in this podcast and any other evergreen podcast, you can go to evergreenpodcast.com to discover all the different stories we have to tell.
Hear Her Sports is a podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about women striving to improve and make a difference in their lives. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery, a former professional cyclist. In every episode, I introduce a female athlete or woman in the business of sport through a thoughtful conversation about who they are and the terrific work they're doing. My guests and I explore the glorious and frustrating issues in sports, history, equity, training, nutrition, and so much more. Join us for inspiration, for community, and for love of being a strong, athletic woman.